Thank you. So um, the, uh, the common characteristic amongst the three of us up here is that we invest a lot. Not, I'd say with us we invest almost exclusively in the applications layer of the web. So that's not the pipes and the routers and the switches or the carriers. It's the services that run on top of that platform. And the concern that we have is that the internet as we know it today is actually somewhat of an accident. It's an accident that occurred as a result of a set of standards that was created by the government, and then a market that evolved during an era when there was neither the technology nor was there the market power to allow any single vendor to determine what services were actually launched on that network. So the result of that is that you had a permissionless innovation environment. So when you had a company like an eBay who had this wacky idea of trading Pez dispensers and betting on betting that people would actually trust each other across this medium that nobody had ever played with before, it wouldn't have flown if somebody in some position of authority had to say, yeah, it doesn't make much sense to me, I don't think so. And the same thing with one of our investments, Twitter. If you imagine going to Randall Stephenson, who runs AT&T, and saying, we want to launch this thing where people are going to just spew out what they had for breakfast this morning in 140 characters, and we think there ultimately will be a business there. We can't tell you what it's going to be, but we think you should do it. And they're going to say, well, what's the business model? What's in it for us? How much can we get out of it? And it would never have seen the light of day. So the reason that this is really important to us, and I'll be fairly brief. I mean, I love to talk about this. There's lots of things to talk about. But the reason it's important to us is that we depend on direct access to consumers in the investments that we make. And if there's a gatekeeper in the mix, then we are not going to be able to make the investments. We're not going to be able to put the capital into these young startup companies because they're not going to be able to get ultimately to consumers. And I think that the key thing to recognize about what's happening with the FCC today is that it is not, as it has been portrayed, a big regulatory intrusion into the private sector. It is actually an effort to try and maintain the status quo. And the reason for that is that the internet as we know it emerged in an era when there were 2,000 independent service providers who provided access to the internet through dial-up. And at that point, there was no concentration of market power that would allow any single vendor to decide whether or not you could get onto the internet. There also, at that time, in the mid-90s, was no technology to actually go and look inside a packet and see what was in that packet. And so because there was no market power and no technology, it, by default, was a permissionless environment. We now have a situation where the vast majority of Americans get internet through a broadband provider. There are almost always only two in any particular market. There's a very big concentration of market power there. And those two providers are deploying the technology that would allow you to actually go inside the packet and figure out what's there. So I'll leave you with one thought, and that is that if the post office, back in the offline days, had actually opened our envelopes, looked inside our mail, and decided based on the content of that mail how to price the transmission of that, we would be completely outraged. And the idea that a private vendor is going to go look inside our transmissions, our communications, and then decide based on whatever criteria they choose whether to pass it along or not, how to price it, is a similar outrage, I think, from my perspective.
Thanks, Brett.